writings of Keynes, you will realize that it's more than that. It's much more nuanced. That actually what happened in the macroeconomic theory was just a summary of very well, some would say badly done summary of Keynesian arguments. So the idea from post-Keynesian economists is actually, let's go back to the roots, let's go back to the classics and read Keynes again. Why is it post-Keynesian economics? Because Keynes wasn't a post-Keynesian. Keynes was the founding father. The post-Keynesian world would come after Keynes. And this idea about what came after Keynes was strictly related to his students. So his students were all based, at least in the beginning, were based in Cambridge in the United Kingdom, and with some other supporters. So we have a number of names. Some of them are recognized, some not that much. But I think people like Mikhail Kaletsky, Jon Robinson, Nicholas Calder, and many others that developed this tradition that is still considered a heterodox tradition, but has been growing. And has been growing especially after all the financial crises we have been seeing around in the world in the past decades. Every time there is a new crisis, people refer to a post-Keynesian economist. The last one was Hyman Minsky. So probably heard about Minsky, the Minsky moment. So this is a very strong post-Keynesian theory that came back to the mainstream of the debate. And the idea of post-Keynesianism is also to go back to a kind of political economy. That's why it links also to the discussions that Arpan will present to you after my presentation, because you put social conflicts, you put power relations in the center. It's not the idea that markets can allocate in a way that you solve all the conflicts in society. The idea is that the conflicts are there. The conflicts are imminent. There is classes, there is labor capital, there is the role of finance, and those social groups are stratified in terms of class, but also, as we see more recently in the debates on diversity, also stratified along gender, along ethnicity. So there is all this need to observe those problems in the center of economic theory. And also the idea that we are not abstract economists, which have to be rooted in historical context, in institutional settings. So that's the idea of post-Keynesianism, is to return to this historical view, political economy view, understanding this from the lens of the works by Keynes. So who are Keynes? I mean, why we discuss this guy? I mean, who is John Maynard Keynes? Well, he was a finance investor. I mean, he's someone that tried to find a way to solve the capitalist system. So he is someone that observed the crisis after 1929. He saw what was going on, and he had a very clear interpretation about the reasons why the crisis happened. And this interpretation is linked to the instability of markets. So he's part of a London circle of intellectuals. So he's part of the elite. He's not someone that came from the working class, for instance. He's an elite economist. He was supervised by the neoclassicals, so the people that were strongly eminent in neoclassical economics. Alfred Marshall, who is probably one of the founding fathers, a person who did the first textbook on more contemporary economics. Arthur Pigou, so that you probably are aware of that if you have studied macroeconomics. And Keynes has a vast number of publications. So we have the treatises, the treatise on probability, the treatise on money, and obviously the most important book by Keynes, which is The General Theory. And I'm pretty sure that if you haven't read it, at least you had a look at it. And why is Keynes important? I mean, that's a picture of myself, and sorry for that, but this is like, it has like a blue plaque in London, which only the very important people have. And and why do we have to study Keynes? It's not just because I like it, but Keynes is also considered one of the big names. This is a picture I took When I was visiting Arpan, we were working in this paper together. I went to India to Flame University, and in their inside their library, there is like this pillar with all names that of eminent scholars, and we see that the only economist in the 20th century that we see there is actually Keynes. So this is obviously doesn't represent the relevance of the economist per se, but it shows why this person is usually considered and well regarded in society as one of the big names in our field. So one disclaimer before we start, post-Keynesians are not new Keynesians. What? Yes, yes. There's something very particularly important that distinguish the new Keynesians, which is a very mainstream school of thought today, to post-Keynesian economics, which is a very heterodox and kind of marginal school of thought in the mainstream. So post-Keynesian economics is heterodox, focusing on this return to Keynes, on the classicals, on the readings. New Keynesians are the tributaries of the new post-new classical synthesis. So they actually believe in adding micro foundations to market failures in the concept of rationality. And why is this so important? Because for new Keynesians, markets are stable, but they fail. And these failures justify intervention. For post-Keynesian economists, the markets are, it's not that they have failures. They have a system that in itself can be unstable by its own characteristics. So markets are unstable. And this instability is characteristic of the market. It's not just one small failure that you solve with one small intervention. It's something that it's more profound than that. So what is the post-Keynesian question then? Well, first is this criticism to the idea of stability of markets. So neoclassical traditions will argue that, well, flu employment is the norm. There is the non-acceleration inflation rate of unemployment. There can be some unemployment caused by frictional structural reasons, but any deviation is explained by shock or imperfections or policy mistakes. And this is what creates unemployment. It's policy mistake. Post-Keynesian economics will have a different perspective. They will understand the market economist in the capitalist system as liable to fluctuations by its own characteristics. The system itself can be unstable. And crisis and unemployment are the norm. And this is rational. And full employment can be explained only under certain particular circumstances. And those circumstances are related strictly to the role of demand in the economy. So that's why the demand is so important. And what I mean when I talk about demand, mainly spending. The idea that spending is not automatic, is not a result of production, is not what we call the Say's law, the circular flow, that actually everything that we produce, we end up consuming because spending will circulate in the economy. For post-Keynesian economics, that's not necessarily true because people have motives to why they would hoard money, they would try to take money out of the flow, they would decide not to spend. Firms may decide not to spend, individuals may decide not to spend. And when we don't spend, we generate a very strong problem of demand, and this problem of demand will affect decisions of production and will end up increasing unemployment under the high uncertainty. I'm already anticipating the one of the main arguments, but I will go back to that again. So there is then a central role of investment and income distribution in post-Keynesian economics. And why is investment so important? Because if you go back to the neoclassical school, investment is a result of savings. So you can invest more because your economy is saving more, you have more resources available. As you have more resources available, you can invest and increase the capital stock of your economy. However, post-Keynesians will argue, coming back to Keynes, that investment is not an automatic decision. Actually, investment is a very complicated and nuanced decision that takes into consideration expectations, that takes into consideration interest rates, that takes into consideration what Keynes will call the animal spirit, the perceptions that agents will have about the future, and how these perceptions will be brought to present value and will be calculated under certain scenarios in people's mind in a world that is completely uncertain. And these very difficult way of rationalizing will end up being fundamental in the decision of making an investment, which is completely detached from the savings rate. So this is one of the very important decisions and theories of the post-Keynesians. Also, productive capacity, it's something particularly important. The idea that we don't have full employment, not only of labor, we don't see full employment of capital as well. What does it mean? It means that capitalists, producers, usually operate under a certain degree of idle capacity, certain degree of unutilized capacity, because they can allow them to plan and to react to spikes in demand. Because of this planned utilization capacity, there is always the view that you don't have this full utilization of resources. Also, we have something that is not anymore, or is not on the neoclassical view, the idea that political constraints actually affect full employment, in the sense that not that the politics actually end up being a negative effect on the markets that will end up reducing unemployment. The view is a bit different, is that political constraints, in the sense that you start not allowing spending, so the government has a central role of spend, especially when the private agents are not spending. So there are constraints on these spending rules that will end up affecting stabilization and will avoid the economy to reach full employment. So the idea is the opposite from the neoclassical tradition, is that you need government intervention to restabilize the economy and not remove the government intervention to stabilize the economy. So what characterized then post-Keynesian economics? Because I'm talking about many different ideas and haven't been focusing very much on post-Keynesian economics. Well, it's a school of thought. It is, especially in macroeconomics. There are some works right now trying to create like a post-Keynesian microeconomics, but it's still very much being built. But there is quite a lot of empirical work being done right now in post-Keynesian economics. And it's defining contrasts to the mainstream, but includes some distinct school in the post-Keynesian umbrella. So what can we talk about post-Keynesianism? Well, we have the foundation of macroeconomics, which goes back to Keynes. So Keynes says, like it or loaded, he is the reference on macroeconomics. And on the one hand, you have the neoclassical school that in the neoclassical synthesis that gave birth to the old Keynesians like Samuelson, like Modigliani, so the economists from the 50s and 60s. Then the criticism from the monetarists, from Friedman, and from this debate between monetarists and the neoclassical synthesis, there were two schools of thought, the neoclassicals and the neo-Keynesians, which are the mainstream right now. These are the views that, well, we have market failures, we have externalities, but the markets are stable. On the other hand, you have the heterodox view, which come back to the Cambridge Keynesians, the Cambridge school, and Rafa and Johan Robinson, Nicholas Calder, that actually were making a dialogue with and a criticism as well to the Marxists. So the Cambridge Keynesians had a very strong argument with the neoclassicals, but also a very strong argument with the Marxists. And the post-Keynesian school is a synthesis of all this debate. And it is a direct tributary of the Cambridge Keynesians. So we might say that it's the phase 3 of the Keynesian line. You have Keynes as the phase 1 or phase 0, perhaps. The Cambridge Keynesians as the phase 1, and then the phase 2 or phase 3, we can call the post-Keynesians. So what is the history of post-Keynesianism? Well, we go back to Keynes, of course. I mean, we can't do that without coming back to Keynes and his book on the general theory of employment, interest, and money from 1936, in which he tried to find a solution to the Great Depression. So from his book, that is a classical, and I recommend everyone to read it, we go to the Cambridge Circles. So what is the Cambridge Circles? Are mainly the students of John Maynard Keynes and some other people based in Cambridge in the UK that used to meet regularly to discuss Keynesian ideas, and not only Keynesian ideas, but to discuss economics, but from this Keynesian point of view. So you had Richard Kahn, James Mead, John Robinson, Austin Robinson, and Piers Raffa that started this view with the debate that came out to be known as the Cambridge Capital Controversies. Perhaps some of you are aware of this capital controversies. So we have the works of like Joan Robinson, which is one of the big names in post-Keynesian economics right now, and she is one of the central figures on this Cambridge Capital Controversies. And why do we call it Cambridge Capital Controversies? Because this was a debate between two views: the Cambridge UK, which is the Keynesian view, and the Cambridge, Massachusetts, US in the MIT. And this MIT school was the neoclassical school. So you have Solow, you have a number of economists from the mainstream view that will debate against the post-Keynesian economists. So you have the Cambridge controversies then that took place in the 60s and the 70s. And this lasted until the 1970s with the paper by Kregel and Eichner, and the realization by Sidney Weintraub that he had a very similar view as the Cambridge UK economists. So what were the Cambridge Capital Controversies then? This is a very theoretical and kind of abstract, sometimes exoteric discussion on the role of macroeconomics or aggregation, the role of aggregation of microeconomic behavior in the economy. And the main debate is focused on the productive functions, so aggregate productive functions, in the sense that post-Keynesian economists will argue that there is no way that we can simply aggregate individual behavior into an aggregate production function, that it doesn't make any sense, because you're summing capitals with a completely different nature in the same function. And the role of capital goods and a critique of capital of this role of how to measure capital. So that's why we call capital controversies, because the most central view is that post-Keynesian economists, or the Cambridge Keynesians like Robinson and Raffa, will criticize very much what's being done by Samuelson and Solow in the MIT, saying that capital cannot be measured. There is a very big problem on measuring capital, which comes from some kind of circularity. So you're measuring capital using its price, which is the rental rate of capital, which cannot be measured unless you know the value of capital. So you have a circularity in the measure of capital that generates a very big theoretical problem. But as I told you, it is kind of abstract when you think about it. So we have then the controversy from the UK side that end up being labeled post-Keynesians. And, well, people argue that theoretically the UK side won the debate, but in practice, the debate was just forgotten. And the mainstream continued to do, the neoclassical school continued to do its work, ignoring the results of the debate. So because the debate was quite heavily mathematical, they were basically focused on academic debate. And this was the academic debate on the 60s and 70s. If you open American Economic Review, at that time, you will find an article by Robinson and an article by Samuelson, and they themselves fighting against the view that a capital cannot be measured. So this was the debate on economics. It wasn't just a marginal discussion that I'm bringing back to the table. This is what has been done in the center of the economic field. So this was particularly important, but as I told you, it was forgotten. So we have the discussion on the nature and role of capital goods, the critique of the neoclassical vision of aggregate production function, and the problems that we cannot extend microeconomic. We have something called the fallacy of composition. What is the fallacy of composition? We cannot simply aggregate microeconomic concepts to a macroeconomic dynamics, okay? So this is something particularly important in the Cambridge controversies debate. So then, just to summarize the Cambridge debate, it's impossible to measure value of capital goods. John Robinson criticized the ability of equilibrium to analyze growth and accumulation process, actually arguing that the process of economic development is not a process of equilibrium, it's actually a process of disequilibrium, of disruption, of change, and not the process of stability. And there's some other concepts that I'll not enter here, like re-switching and reverse capital deepening. And if you're interested, I recommend going back to Joan Robinson. She has a very amazing book on the capital controversies, okay? So the conclusion of the debate is that the neoclassical side, the MIT side and neoclassical side, nowadays simply ignore its existence, and many don't even know about it. It is something that became only something that the post-Keynesians are still carrying, because the post-Keynesians still believe that, well, they won this debate and they should be acknowledged by that, in the way that the mainstream should recognize the theoretical problems in estimating aggregate production function. There is an article from John McCombie and Jesus Felipe that argues from last year, actually, criticizing the Cobb-Douglas production function and all different other types of production functions that are used on macroeconomics on these grounds. And so the idea is that mainly the capital controversies became a historical fact and is not in the theory of the discussions right now. So then, why did I come back to the capital controversies? Because the foundation of post-Keynesian economics is a result of this debate. So the post-Keynesian the post-Keynesian economic manifesto is actually a result of what came after the Cambridge controversies, in which the third generation with Kregel is still presenting, is still very active. They try to bring back these Keynesian concepts and establish the post-Keynesian economics as a field of research. So there's the foundation of the Cambridge Journal of Economics, which was particularly important. And if you are a heterodox economist, this is actually where you want to publish. You have the Journal of Post-Keynesian Economics, that was both in 77, 78, which is a result of the Post-Keynesian Economics Manifesto. The Review of Political Economy and the ROPE in 1989. Now we have the Review of Keynesian Economics as well. So we have a number of post-Keynesian places where we can publish. And the community starts being developed since the foundation of post-Keynesian economics with the 3S Summer School, the Review of Political Economy conferences in the Great Malvern in the UK, the post-Keynesian conference. Now you have the Berlin Summer School every year in Berlin. It is a very nice conference. It's probably the largest one in post-Keynesian economics right now. And every year it's very good to see post-Keynesian scholars there. There's the Nordic Post-Keynesian Economic Conference, where I actually met Kosal, and I actually where I was with Arpan last time presenting our paper. There are some other post-Keynesian. There is one in Rio every year. So there is a community that is growing and is being developed nowadays in the post-Keynesian field. So you see, this is a picture I took 2 years ago. You see people are still wearing masks, so we're still during COVID times. But this is like, I think it was 2021. you can see how many people are actually interested in this topic. So those are all scholars. Many of them I know, and we see that they are particularly interested. And the young generations are also very much interested in this field. And there's a lot of communities like the Post-Keynesian Economic Society in the United Kingdom, which is where actually an important part of the debates are done. So I recommend, if you're interested, to enter the website. The FMM in Berlin. There's the Brazilian Keynesian Association, the Argentinian Keynesian Association, the Italian Post-Keynesian Association. So there is a number of country associations on post-Keynesian economics right now. And so I recommend having a look, and there are some post-Keynesian scholars in Japan, some post-Keynesian scholars in Cambodia as well. So we have an interesting number of people.
Sorry, Professor, you have 5 minutes more.
No worries, no worries. 5 minutes is enough. I know I have a lot of slides, but I will talk a little bit about the theory then, and in 5 minutes and finish. So what is the concern of post-Keynesian economics, coming back to the manifesto by Krieger and Eichner? First, growth and cycles. So cycles are a fundamental aspect of post-Keynesian economics, because cycles are endogenous to the system. Cycles are not just the result of external shocks, but something that happens because of the economy. Also a concern with history, a concern with time, a concern with things that path dependence, we call. What happened in the past affects what happens in the future. So it's not just based on abstract models with rational agents, and you just put them in a way that they can interact into markets, and that will end up resulting in the best outcome possible. There is an important role of history. Institutional theory. So institutions play a central role. I know institutions nowadays are in the neoclassical school, but this only came to the table very recently. The heterodox have been discussing the institutionalism in a much longer frame of time. Incomplete information, fundamental uncertainty. And I think fundamental uncertainty is something particularly important. The idea that we don't know what's going to happen. And I may tell you, I mean, it might be, don't take my word for granted, but it might be that perhaps out of nowhere, we are living our lives and we have to spend 2 years using masks closing our places. Imagine how crazy that would be. And this happened. So because we don't know what's going to happen in the future, we are completely unaware. Because we are completely unaware, making decisions is something that is practically based on expectations. So we cannot probabilistically give values to what's going to happen in the future. So because we don't know, we have fundamental uncertainty, our decisions are based on our expectations. And our expectations, by affecting our decisions, will affect the outcome. So what we call self-fulfilling prophecies. So the way we are thinking about the future will affect the way we behave in the present, that we will affect the future. So this is something particularly important in post-Keynesian economics. Markets are imperfect. Market has oligopolistic. There's markup pricing. Inflation is a result of conflicting claims. Inflation is a result of this strong conflict between workers and capitalists. We live in an economy in which money plays a role. And money plays a role not only because money can be used to buy things or to measure things, but money plays a role because money has one particularly important attribute that affects our decisions, which is called liquidity. So money is the liquid asset. Because it is a liquid asset, it's the asset we all want to go to when we are feeling uncertain. Because money makes our decisions and make us less worried. Money is something that calms us. It's like a medicine. When you have some cash with you, even if you're going through tough times, you feel more relaxed. If you don't have anything liquid that you can just spend in case you are feeling like precautionary spending, or precautionary saving, sorry, you will be feeling like you are in a very complicated situation. So money plays a role in our motives, in our decision. And we have that it's not investment that adjusts to savings, but actually savings will adjust to investment because the investment decision is the central one in the economy, basically from the fact that one, money is not neutral, two, we have effective demand. So this is particularly important in post-Keynesian economics. There are many other different post-Keynesian features. We can have the view by Lavoie that talks about the non-reversibility of time, that we cannot come back in time. We cannot press reset. It's not a video game. So life keeps going on. And that's why we cannot just reproduce the past. We have to understand what's going on under current circumstances to understand what we can do about the economy. So that's the idea of social conflict, effective demand, fundamental uncertainty as the pillars of post-Keynesian economics. I will go a bit quick, but there's effective demand. The role of demand is fundamental in determining the economic outcomes. Spending plays a role. Fundamental uncertainty, as I told you, we don't know what the future is going to be. So it's very hard to be rational with full, perfect information. So what we do to make our decisions, we follow conventions. We look at what other people are doing, or we focus on our social norms or on institutions, on how things have been done historically, and that's how we make our decisions. There's a strong criticism to the argument of rationality, because it's impossible to deal with all the information, and even the information we have is partial. And there's what we call non-ergodicity, which is non-reversibility of time. We cannot just repeat time. We have uncertainty. So this is all the things that keep coming back to post-Keynesian economics. Okay, the role of social conflicts, the role of capital workers and rentiers. The role of rentiers is particularly important because rentiers will be seen as one of the classes that actually is the one that are central in the process of generating effective demand. The problem of effective demand, of lack of effective demand, because they will actually be the one drawing resources from the economy. Can talk about that during questions, but it's something that's particularly important. And if we can keep going, there is all the discussions we can talk about post-Keynesian economics. Involuntary unemployment, which is fundamental in post-Keynesian economics, in the idea that employment is not a choice. Unemployment is not a choice. Unemployment is not because workers do not accept to earn a certain wage, believing that their work is better than it is. Unemployment is actually something structural in the economy. Unemployment may be something that during uncertainty, you can work almost for free and you cannot find a job. So the idea that there is the lack of spending, the lack of demand that we generate involuntary unemployment. The role of finance and money is fundamental. That's why many post-Keynesians are actually focused. Adam Kareni is there. He is a very good friend and someone that focuses on money and finance and has this post-Keynesian view. So he knows very well how important finance is for post-Keynesian scholars. And there are different post-Keynesian groups. Lavoie divided them into fundamentalists, Kaleskians, Raffians. So if you want to go deep, you can actually see that there's a whole world inside post-Keynesian economics that you can explore. And I invite everybody to learn a bit more about it. I mean, you can read. This is the book by Mark Lavoie, An Introduction to Post-Keynesian Economics. It is a very nice book. I recommend having a look at it. And I can talk just, if you give me 2 minutes, I can talk about some important recent contributions. It is something that, one is the financial instability hypothesis by Minsky, in the way that Minsky states that financial crisis is endogenous to the system because agents will try to, during the periods of boom, will leverage themselves, will try to indebt themselves to make more investments. And this degree of indebtedness will end up reversing during periods of crisis and will create a crisis. Yeah, one final. And stock flow consistent matrix, which is also something very particularly important for sketches. Thank you, Kosal. Sorry for going around time. Thank you very much, guys.
Thank you, Doctor, for your excellent presentation. If the audience have any question, you can raise up now and just one or two question only and make it faster. So if you don't have any other question, we might skip to the other presenters. Do you have any question, please? No? No? Okay, let me go through to the other presenters. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I would like to invite Dr. Arpan Ganguly. That is, he's from the Flem University. He will present about the political economics of the international trade theories and policy. The floor is yours, sir. Thank you. You have 40 minutes for presentation and Q&A. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. Thank you, everyone. I would start by thanking the organizers, Kosal and his team, for setting up this fantastic conference, amazing event. All the running around they've been doing behind the scenes. I know how much work that is. Lots of appreciation for that. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for inviting me. Also, Dr. Satwik and the YSI team, thank you. Also, I'm very glad to present in the same session as my dear friend and colleague, Dr. Spinola. So I'll just now get started. I kind of want to do an overview of the field of international trade theory and policy. Kind of about like 400 years of coverage. It's easier with this. Not working. Okay, okay. So the idea is to do, I hope you can hear me. The idea is to cover the entire field of international trade theory and policy, which is like since the beginning of capitalism, so to say, very briefly. I'll try to do it very briefly. And basically what I want to point out briefly point out is that I'll basically be mapping international trade theory as well as its policy implications. Typically, it's done from a liberal kind of standpoint, whether it's a classical liberal position or a modern version of it, which is the neoliberal position. I will come from a history of economic thought and political economy perspective, looking at these theories more critically, its contributions, especially its contributions in terms of its policy implications, which has not been the trade theories suggestions or recommendations, policy recommendations have not been very conducive for economic development in the periphery, in the global south. So coming from that kind of a perspective, I'll be focusing on international flows of goods and services and not labor. There's a whole debate on the trade of labor as well, immigration debates and so on. So to just keep it, you can't hear? Okay, sorry. Yeah, just hands keep moving. Okay, so I'll keep the trade of labor discussion or immigration and so on separate. We can talk about it during the discussion, but just to keep it on the flow of goods and services. So I'll cover the theory from pre-classical to the modern, the most contemporary version of trade theory, which is given by global value chains or global production networks. What I'll basically point out is that there is a historical tussle between in terms of trade theory, there's a historical tussle between classical liberalism versus modern liberalism, which is the neoliberalism, which is basically neoliberalism, or the neoclassical economics applied to the context of policymaking is what I mean by neoliberalism. We also see in terms of, that was in terms of trade theory, and we'll see that political economy lies on the fringe of these primary trade theory debates. All our textbooks trade textbooks, even till date, there's barely any trade textbooks that include political economy explicitly. They're still all from a classical liberal, Smith, Ricardo, and basically and neoclassical versions, but also neoclassical reading of classical trade theory, which also I'll talk about, right? Which also itself is problematic, not reading classicals in their own terms, but using a neoclassical methodology to read classicals, right? And I'll say that how political economy lies on the fringes. This is theory part. In terms of trade policy, basically we'll see a, over history, basically swing between protectionism and free trade. That's kind of the debate. And and I'll conclude with where we are today. And once we have the historical reading, what can we learn and what can we do? Where do we stand now in terms of trade theory, and where do we go from there? So this is again quite similar. Just one point to highlight is we'll see that in terms of trade theory, there's been a rise and fall of trade theory. And, in that process, this difference between classical liberalism, which I'll explain more, and neoliberalism is also a tension between understanding conflict in trade versus understanding coordination in markets, which is the neoclassical version. And I will approach it from the context of power and distributional conflict that is very much integral to how we understand trade theory as well as trade policy. So going back to starting with, before Adam Smith, before the classical theorists of trade, which is basically once we have a formed kind of a defined system of capitalism. Prior to that, in feudalism, trade was thought in a more national context. It was thought of in a more, individual landlord owners and individual agricultural laborers were engaging in trade on a trade-to-trade basis, on an individual basis. It's scattered. It's not one concrete system of trade, which we see later develop with the system of capitalism. And so this is feudalism, but we have a debate. So prior to the formation of capitalism, so there is this famous Dobbs-Sweezy debate, which many of you might be aware, which basically discusses the idea of when did feudalism end and when did capitalism begin. So Dobbs basically proposes that feudalism continues pretty much till the beginning of middle of 18th century, 1700s, when a more defined system of capitalism could be seen. But Sweezy argues that actually the era from 14th to 16th century is not feudalism. It's what he calls petty commodity production, basically individual mercantile production. Like this transition period between 14th and 16th century is referred to as a system where capitalism is being formed. It's a transitionary period, according to Sweezy. And it's a very interesting debate that you guys can look up if you're interested. So the formation of capitalism also required the discovery of trade routes, right? The Columbus and Ferdinand and all these explorers finding other countries, and that process needed to happen. As that process worked out, over time, a system of capitalism was established, and then within that system, we can understand how we understand trade theory today. And basically, the Dobbs-Sweezy debate was about understanding trade versus petty commodity production. What I do want to highlight is all this debate. Within all this debate is an underlying tension is that of Eurocentrism, right? So all these and that continues even after in the classical era, that you're focusing on Britain or you're focusing on Western Europe to understand the transition. Now, what was the agricultural system in the global South? What was the economic system, so to say, in the global South? That is not understood. It was argued that China, India, and what was also argued by one of our presenters in the morning, that maybe economic theory started in Asia. We had a system, we had a very enriching process of economic thought already, as well as an economic system in place. It's just not understood. It's just seen as something different, something inferior. And that is the kind of underlying Eurocentrism at work there. Specifically, once we have the system of petty commodity production and then the transition to capitalism, we have mercantilist school of thought, which kind of proposes the idea of trade in a more formed way. These are one of the first instances of formal trade theory, and especially Kenne. In Kenne, we see a very limited understanding of trade from a modern, where we stand today from a modern point of view, Kenne basically argued that it is only the manufacturing sector, which he called the unproductive or sterile sector, that engages in trade. But also, there should be a reciprocity of needs in terms of the input output should be exactly equal. So it's very limited in the way it's presented in mercantilist thought. But mercantilist thought is ripe with the idea of trade being presented from a nationalist and colonialistic point of view, right? So in mercantilism, there is this idea that accumulation of national wealth at whatever cost is important, is the primary goal, right? Increase the wealth of Britain. How, if you have to go colonize and get gold and other precious metals from other parts of the world, do it. As long as you're increasing national wealth, that's the primary goal here. So from that perspective, it kind of approves colonization in a way, right? Which is highly problematic. The idea is as you accumulate, as you bring precious metals and gold, silver, etc., from underdeveloped other regions of the world, you're basically able to increase trade surplus, increase wealth of the nation. That's how you're growing. So growth is tied to colonization in a way. But the problem here is not a zero-sum game. If you're extracting from some other part of the world, it's not actually being compensated. The other region is absolutely worse off, and not, the whole net gain at the world level does not compensate the loss that developing countries have seen during that time through the process of colonization. Moving on, now we come to classical theories of trade. The kind of criticism of mercantilism came from Hume, Robert Hume, and the idea of price specie flow mechanism, which is basically how inflow of precious metals from the other regions of the world into Britain would actually worsen trade balance, right? Because it would increase the prices of these imported goods. And so your trade balance will have higher import value than your export value, leading to a decrease in trade surplus. So the attempt to increase trade surplus through a flow mechanism will reduce trade surplus, right? So that was one of the counters to the mercantilist way of thinking. Now, with Adam Smith and David Ricardo, we find the first kind of general theory of trade, right, that they propose. I'll look at them very briefly individually, but broadly clubbing them together as kind of the, I'm not clubbing Marx in this, because Marx is a different perspective on trade. And Marx doesn't qualify as a classical liberal thinker. So, and we can, you can question the way I'm classifying them as classical liberal, or what I mean by classical liberal. We can discuss that. But with Smith and Ricardo, what we see, and this can also go back to the idea of what is classical liberalism in the way I'm thinking, is the idea of methodological holism. Understanding the national economy, not individual processes, not understanding individuals, not understanding from a microeconomic perspective, firm behavior, individual behavior. It's understanding national economy. When Smith says wealth of the nations, he could have called it like income of the nations. He called it wealth of the nation because in that sense, wealth, it's a certain methodological approach where you want to study the science of wealth, right? And not the science of choice, which is what neoclassical economics has reduced economics to, a science of choice-making, decision-making. That's not what it is. For classicals, it's a science of wealth. How do you increase the national wealth of an economy? Which today, if you want to understand parallelly today, it's how do you increase economic growth? So the second distinction, very important distinction that the classicals do is basically the idea, distinguishing production and distribution, right? So, and this distinction that the classicals did continues through all of trade theory, distinguishing patterns of trade from gains from trade, right? Patterns of trade is why do you trade what you trade, okay? The goods and services. What do you specialize in? What do you export? Gains from, that is the production dimension. Distribution, on the other hand, is the idea of who benefits from this pattern of trade. Okay, which factor of production benefits and which factor of production loses out. And this distinction is fundamental to trade theory. No, every economics textbook, trade theory textbook that the standard textbooks of Krugman or Feenstra, whichever one you refer to, they are all distinguishing trade in terms of patterns of trade, what do you export and why, versus gains from trade. Who benefits from this existing pattern of trade? Which factor of production specifically, and also which nation? The other distinction of classical theory is focusing on the idea of technological differences, right? So the source of trade is technological differences. Developed and developing countries start at different levels because they start at different technological levels. And because of that, they're able to export, they're able to specialize in and export different types of goods, which then leads to the idea of, so based on technological differences, you will have specialization and division of labor. And division of labor is fundamental to the way classicals model trade, which neoclassicals give up, like don't focus on, it's ignored. So technological differences leads to patterns of specialization leads to mutually beneficial trade, which is linked to economic growth. What we will see later when I discuss neoclassical versions of trade theory is the impact on growth is very much ignored somewhere. The impact of, or even if not ignored, less emphasized, not as emphasized as in the classical framework. And division of labor is central. We also, the way classicals model trade, especially in terms of the importance of the factors of production that are important for your specialization, they focus on, for a country to specialize in certain good, is driven by labor, right? Labor is given a fundamental position over capital. And this is because of the reliance on labor theory of value. That, the separation between value and prices, which again, the neoclassicals ignore, or underplay. Because for neoclassicals, it doesn't matter. It's an unnecessary waste of time to do a detour through from prices to unpack prices, go back to the value, what is the source of value, and then come back to prices. Why do we need to do that when prices, when all you need to do is look at demand and supply, wherever they meet, that's the prices. If that's what society has decided is the price of a good, then that must be the value of a good as well. So the distinction between value and prices is not necessary in classicals. In neoclassicals. But for classicals, it is central, and we can come back to that. The other issue is the neoclassicals understand, I'll come back to it, but neoclassicals understand classical trade theory or reinterpret classical theory in terms of marginal productivities. That is not what classicals do. Marginal analysis is not something that classicals do. They look at costs, okay, costs driven by labor and comparative labor cost, to be precise, which is not equal to marginal productivities of labor in different sectors. So briefly coming to Smith, I have some quotes. I'm not going to get into the quotes. I just have them so we can always refer back to them if we want to talk more about it. But what we see in Smith is a very broad, holistic understanding of trade, which is linked to the notion of production, right? So the nature of production is then linked to the patterns of trade. And of course, all of us who have read history of economic thought are aware, or Smith, know about his famous pin factory example. But the pin factory example is simply specialization in the shop floor level, in the factory, within a factory, right? But the woolen coat example that is understudied sometimes is a case where we see the broad focus or the holistic approach that these classicals like Smith had, which is to understand the interconnected nature of production involving multiple labor from multiple different regions of the world, right? The woolen coat is a product of joint labor of a great multitude of workmen, right? The shepherd, the sorter of the wool comber, the dyer, the scribbler, the spinner, must all join their different arts in order to complete even this homely production, right? What I want to emphasize with this quote is simply the idea that the classicals are able to grasp the globally interconnected nature of production. When we go to the most modern version of trade theory, which is the global value chains and global production networks, that school of thought argues that their analysis of the splitting of production operations and the global outsourcing of production operations is unique. I would like to argue that it's not unique, right? Division of the production process into subparts and the interconnected nature of global labor in producing each subpart, is something that the classicals were aware of. Just to highlight the point that in the classical framework, specialization is based on the division of labor. This is the point that modern neoclassicals ignore, or neoclassical theory in general sidesteps. The labor too, which is necessary to produce any one complete manufacture, is almost always divided among a great number of hands How many different trades are employed in each branch of the linen and woolen manufacturers? And he goes on. And he also highlights that this kind of a specialization based on division of labor, international in character, can be attributed to the manufacturing sector. Agricultural sector, you're unable to have so much finer and finer divisions of labor. We all know that Smith gave us the absolute advantage theory of trade, but the absolute advantage theory of trade is also a way that Smith doesn't necessarily refer to absolute advantage. He doesn't call it absolute advantage. It simply means that one country is better off in the production of an array of goods because of their technological superiority, right? So that country, when it's trading with a country that is technologically inferior, will have a net gain always. Will have a, will always be in a better position to trade with them. So the idea of uneven development in some sense, power difference, unequal exchange is something that the classicals recognize. That, and a lot of interpretations of modern neoclassicals will say that Ricardo got the idea right, and with comparative advantage, that makes more logical sense. Absolute advantage is irrelevant today. But I would like to argue, and you can let me know what you think about that. But I would like to argue that the absolute advantage theory is still relevant because it has a space to understand how some nations are technologically superior and have are in a better position than when they trade with other inferior technology smaller nations. So for instance, when you look at US trading with many African countries, they are definitely technologically superior. They have an absolute advantage, and the power difference is central there, right? That has not disappeared. Coming to Ricardo constructs the basic premises of a contemporary version of free trade, and you can see the idea of comparative advantage being born here with Ricardo. He's one of the first to lay it out in the exact terms. The Ricardian idea of free trade or comparative advantage comes from his frustration with the Corn Laws. And basically, the Corn Law was the idea that it was a law that was imposed by pressure from the elite landlordial classes in Britain on the government, which basically banned the import of cheap agricultural goods, cheap corn, especially from abroad, right? Because that would mean that the agriculturalists in the landlordian class, the landlordial class in Britain would lose out if you're importing cheaper corn from abroad, right? So Ricardo was very critical of the Corn Laws, and and in some sense he believed that the industrialists are being not fairly treated, and these Corn Laws should be abandoned because then England as a whole would receive cheaper corn, and it's better for the welfare of the citizens rather than the welfare of the landlords. Comparative advantage for Ricardo is understood in terms of comparative labor costs. Comparative labor costs comes from differences in labor hours or labor time. And this is one difference between Smith and Ricardo. So for Smith, it is the quantity of labor, right? So he has this concept of labor embodied in a commodity versus labor commanded, which leaves his labor theory of value a little confounding or confused. Ricardo basically says that once you do not think in terms of quantity of labor, but think in terms of labor time, you can sort this issue of labor embodied versus labor commanded. So once you comparative labor costs in Ricardo is measured in terms of labor time, and that is the source of comparative advantage. And later we will see that neoclassicals will criticize the classicals for their focus on supply side analysis, because it's a supply side way of measuring, because you're focusing on the importance of factors of production, labor, in contributing to the price of your exported commodities. In terms of gains from trade, Ricardo believes that once you trade in terms of comparative labor costs, labor is relatively better off than without. And there are more nuances there, which I'm not getting into now. In terms of limitations, one limitation is the impact of large-scale machinery on the patterns and gains from trade. This is where Ricardo was not very explicit about, or he wasn't very clear about. This is something that we have to wait till Marx for him to build on, right? The dynamics of large-scale machinery and its impact on trade, large-scale industry and its impact on trade, which is probably a product of its time in the sense that the industry was not as developed during Ricardo's time as during Marx's. So Marx was looking at a little more industrialized English society than Ricardo. Now, this is the classical school of thought. Now we come to the introduction of political economy and its understanding of trade, which comes with Marx. And that's why Marx cannot be qualified as a classical liberal in that sense, because it's a completely different approach. The methodology is completely different of historical materialism. Marx talks about large-scale machinery and industrial capitalism, fills the gap, and focuses on the idea of international division of labor. He says that on one hand, the immediate effect of machinery is to increase the supply of raw material. On the other hand, the cheapness of articles produced by machinery and the revolution in the means of transport and communication provide the weapons for the conquest of foreign markets. A new and international division of labor springs up, one suited to the requirements of the main industrial countries, and it converts one part of the globe into a chiefly agricultural field of production for supplying the other part, which remains a preeminently industrial field. So we can already see the idea of uneven development here. We can already see the idea of Marx being very different from how classicals are thinking, where he's able to understand that the globe is now being split in terms of its in terms of the idea of colonization or imperialism is something he's able to recognize that very much plays a role in how trade happens and who benefits from trade. It's not a value neutral, it's not a power neutral process. It's very much a power laden process. So I'll skip this. We can come back to that about the idea that you have to think of value in a global context. He recognizes the role of colonization and imperialism. He recognizes that not just international, but also there's territorial division of labor, which confines special branches of production to special districts of a country, acquires fresh stimulus from the system of manufacturing, which exploits all natural peculiarities. So finally, he recognizes the distributional consequences of international division of labor, the idea of gains from trade. But here, there's he recognizes the conflict between labor and capital in terms of who benefits from this process of trade, right? So, and he recognizes that there's going to be a hierarchy of labor powers. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip. Now, neoclassical interpretation of classical trade theory, what happens with the Austrians and then the marginalist school of thought, right? And I'm just summarizing it now, and then we'll look at some details of it, of the neoclassical approach. I think calling it marginalist is slightly a more appropriate terminology than calling them neoclassicals, because neoclassical means that they are interpreting classical theory a certain way, but it's not. I mean, they're I'm not getting the term, but they are successors of classical thought, but it's not. They're quite different from classical thought. So marginalist would be a more appropriate term, but what they offer in terms of trade theory specifically, the depoliticized, ahistorical, power-free account, how they read classicals, which I kind of mentioned earlier, is that technological differences leads to differences in labor costs, especially in terms, and they think of it in terms of opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is not something which the classicals think about. And they provide a static model of trade. So what neoclassicals refer to and call the classical model of trade is simply a static version of the classical model of trade. But some of the quotes I mentioned earlier shows that classical trade is definitely not static. It has a very dynamic understanding of global, interconnected global nature of production and trade. They use Smith and Ricardo to justify free trade. They champion these classical thinkers as free trade theorists, which is not exactly true. These scholars also recognize the important role of government and governance. And pretty much they ignore the political economy aspect, which we'll have. Now, the backlash to classical trade theory, which is one of the things that the neoclassicals argue is an advancement over classical trade theory, is the idea that it doesn't model the sub-demand side, right? This is the main kind of criticism of neoclassicals against, or marginalists against classicals. That when I describe to you that you're looking at labor costs, it's basically leading to the price of your exports or imports. That implies that you're basically thinking the price is determined by supply side factors, especially factors of production and their costing. But what about the idea of role? What about the idea of demand? That is kind of the Austrian critique, especially Bentham. We also have Mill and the theory of reciprocal demand, which says that there are limits within which comparative costs will fluctuate, right? So then that limit is set by demand tendencies or demand of specific regions for other countries' goods. Now, what that leads to, and there's of course some fluid area between this classification I'm doing, but what this leads to is the neoclassical version of classical trade advanced thinking in terms of opportunity cost, that you want to measure comparative costs through the idea of opportunity cost. Like one country has a lower opportunity cost than the other, then that's what you'll export. And the development version, the more critical development version, took on this idea in terms of the idea of terms of trade, okay, and especially that terms of trade being inferior for developing countries. So once we go to the marginalist, the so-called marginalist revolution, which happens through the Austrians and then gets solidified with the work of Marshall, took the entire methodological approach or flipped the methodological approach on its head, right? So it went from a macro to a micro analysis of trade. It became obsessed with finding micro theoretic foundations of macroeconomic concepts, which we can, discuss, but it's highly limiting because I sometimes joke that if it's so important to micro-found macro, why don't we go about like doing the other way around, right? Macro-founding micro. Why is that not important? Anyway, so then they also shifted the analysis from nation as the unit of analysis, which the classicals were doing, to firm as the unit of analysis. I will argue later that this movement to firm goes into the domain of like shifting the focus of analysis from nation to the individual or individual firm. This shift is coming from the ideas of industrial organization literature, which itself is something that neoclassical theory or marginalist theory doesn't really explore, because the industrial organization literature itself has a very rich analysis of how, if you look at organizational structure of firms, then you may not end up with an hypothesis of free trade, right? Because there's so much going on there. I discussed this idea, and of course, the whole frame of analysis shifts from methodological holism to methodological individualism, which is the pillar of neoclassical or marginalist economics and continues even today, which is why you see that every single idea is modeled at the firm level or the individual level. This is the idea of focusing on individual as a unit of analysis. The Marshallian revolution claimed that it wanted to model the demand side. It moved the discussion from fixed labor time inputs to or value of goods determined by quantity, labor time, to real costs. And this is kind of what I measured earlier. Why do you want to go from prices to value and come back to prices? You could simply just look at prices, that market determined prices, and consider that to itself be the determination of value. So they moved the discussion from thinking of measuring prices in terms of labor costs to just the total cost of production. Add the costs of all your factors of production, and that's the price of a good. They also looked at changing factor proportions and not, factor coefficients, which is fixed factor coefficients. They looked at the idea of diminishing returns or diminishing returns to scale, ignores the idea of increasing returns, which is later picked up by new trade theory. And of course, the Marshallian analysis gives us like unique equilibria, right? They ignore multiple equilibria, which again is picked up in new trade theory. So the idea is now to account for the role of demand in the analysis too. Now, modern neoclassical version. So this is the change that we see from classical school of thought to a modern neoliberal classical school of thought to the marginalist school of thought, which changed the entire frame of economic analysis, the whole methodology of economic analysis. And now they set up providing their own version of trade theory, which is basically formulated in the Heckscher-Ohlin models of trade and its many variants. And that the idea is now we move from what is the source of comparative advantage. So these are still comparative advantage theories of trade, even the neoclassical version. But what's the source? The source is not technological differences, but endowments. What are you naturally endowed with? What are resource-based explanations for trade rather than technology-based explanations for trade? It completely flips classical theory. It moves to a marginal analysis where returns to factors of production are determined by marginal productivities. Gains are determined by marginal productivity. This is not something that classicals do at all because marginal analysis is another pillar of neoclassical or marginalist school of thought. They assume similar technologies. So basically what the Hexalorian model is arguing is who will trade with each other? Countries that have similar levels of technology. What about countries with different levels of technology? Will they trade with each other or not? Not clear. The free trade was argued to be Pareto optimal, right? Comparative advantage was seen as a demand side phenomena needed to be modeled when you're thinking of comparative advantage, not just the supply side. What they ended up proposing through Hexalorian theory broadly is that patterns of trade leads to equalization of product prices, which leads to equalization of factor prices. Now, this relies on the idea that you would need to have complete specialization and in perfectly competitive markets. Okay, if you have incomplete specialization in imperfect markets, then the idea of factor price equalization is highly suspect. And the idea that, and in terms of gains from trade, what did they end up saying is, what you will see is within countries, inequality may rise, but across countries, wage in the developed country would fall, given that you have increase in the price of the exported good in the developed world. Wages in the developed world will fall, and wages in the developing world will rise, leading to a decrease in global inequality, right? Okay. But we will see later, once we are looking at outsourcing and offshoring models, that this is very much far from the truth. What we are observing is higher global wage inequality, especially in data today. And so, and also in some works that was critical of HO theorems, found that, wage inequality is not necessarily reducing. There are many different subsequent developments. Skipping that. So there was a series of criticisms that was laid against the HO model, which basically ended up, many commentators ended up saying that the HO theory is kind of dead. Comparative advantage by the 70s and 80s was no longer comparative advantage based on the on resource differences in the HO version, was no longer considered to be aptly describing global trade. One was the Leontief paradox, which basically said that US should be exporting. US is a capital-rich country, so a capital-rich country should be exporting capital-intensive goods. But they found that the imports of US had more capital content than the exports of US. So that was the paradox. And there was a lot of debates on how what was the source of that paradox, what data you could use, how can we solve that. Minhas talked about the idea that, which I mentioned, equalization of factor prices cannot be based on an idea of complete and specialization based on perfectly competitive markets. You need to model imperfectly competitive markets. The neoclassical version of trade, the HO trade theory, is a non-monetary theory of trade, right? Because when you say you have equalization of factor prices or equalization of product prices, how do you do that when you have different currencies, right? So you have to then have a monetary theory of production. Then we have the overlapping demand model of Stefan Linder, Swedish economist, who has a better approach to modeling the demand side than the HO version. In 90s, we had the Hexalorian-Wood version of trade. Wood basically argued that, well, you have chosen the wrong factors. That's why you're having the Leontief paradox. Instead of picking resources, distinguishing resources in terms of labor and capital, have it distinguish resources in terms of high skill versus low skill. And then you will see that, the US would be exporting high skill intensive goods. Developing countries would be exporting low skill intensive goods. That would solve the problem. And that gave birth to the series of offshoring models. Now, as Hexalorian theory was dying a slow death, over time, there were a lot of criticisms against the neoclassical version of economics, but also the neoclassical version of trade. What was the criticism? That these assumptions are too strong, right? These assumptions are too unrealistic, doesn't describe real world economies. So there was a need for neoclassical thinkers themselves to relax some of these limiting assumptions. Okay. Oh, is it? Oh, okay. So So the neoclassicals took it upon themselves to relax some of these limiting assumptions of neoclassical economics or marginalist economics, marginal analysis like perfect competition, constant returns to scale, and remove them and see how it works. In short, they relaxed. New trade theory is basically a disaggregated set of contributions. There's no one new trade theory like classical thought or marginalist. Different scholars relaxed different assumptions and tried to then model trade. But what it ended up finding is basically that none of the neoclassical recommendations, especially policy terms, works. What they ended up finding is that once you relax these assumptions, you get completely contradictory results. And they ended up saying that there is no free trade theory once you relax this. Krugman especially, right? Krugman and Helpman, I have a quote from them in a bit. They basically say that their results, basically the new trade theory results, basically ended up finding that protectionism is better, right? Which sounds very contradictory to what the neoclassicals generally believe in, which is the idea of free trade. So new trade theory wanted to relax the assumptions, but when it did, it ended up finding that free trade is not relevant. Maybe protectionism is better, which put neoclassical theory in a soup. Now, of course, what is the focus of new trade theory? One of the main focuses is to say that the source of comparative advantage is neither technology nor resources, like the previous school. Classical technology, Heck-Rolin, resources, it's neither. Comparative advantage doesn't work. It's other explanation, non-comparative advantage-based explanations of trade. What is that? Economies of scale, right? So basically, and I skipped to say that in an effort to do that, what they did was micro-found macro trade theory more and more and more. But so they distinct the idea that with scale economies, you're going to have periodically reducing average costs of production. As you have reducing average costs of production over time at the firm level, it's no longer, so one firm is in a better position over time and can produce and export things at a lower cost than and lower price than everyone else. So it creates regional differences. They tried to model increasing returns to scale, gave up the idea of decreasing returns, focused on, so external and internal economies of scale is simply the idea. Internal economies is simply the idea that the size of the firm leads to scale economies. External is the idea that the size of the industry leads to scale economies. They began to, so you see, they gave up on the idea of course CRS and DRS. They began modeling increasing returns. They began modeling imperfect competition, gave up on the idea of perfectly competitive markets. They tried modeling product differentiation. So the theoretical implications was that scale economies would lead to the global spread of production. So the kind of preempting the offshoring phenomena that set in during this is also during the 80s, but that sets in around then. Imperfect competition is recognized, but power hierarchy between monopolistic firms or oligopolistic firms in one country and smaller firms in other country, that is not modeled, though they are recognizing imperfect competition. And in terms of policy, it became an idea of recommending not free trade, but strategic trade. Specifically, what we found is, in terms of policy recommendations of new trade theory, they saw the waning predictive power of free trade doctrines. Evidence in new trade theory with country data and theoretically ended up justifying protectionism rather than free trade. Many of them ended up saying that, instead of, the state should take the initiative of funding sunrise industries. And this is an argument that we see during the 70s, 60s, 70s in India as well, or even in 80s and 90s, sorry, not 60s, 70s, but 80s and 90s in India, where the idea is that the pharmaceutical industry, the automobile industry, these have a lot of future potential for growth. So, the state's role should be to protect sunrise industries who have significant potential for future growth, but are their initial stages of in the nascent stages of growth. So protect them. So that is something that is very contradictory to neoclassical theory, but they're ending up saying that. And of course, there was no analysis of uneven development in the way classicals did that. And so, given the criticism of, or given the analysis in free trade theory, are free trade doctrines, policy-wise, still relevant? And this is a quote from Helpman and Krugman, who wrote this book on market structures, which is kind of one of the foundational books of new trade theory. this is what they're saying, right? If you read the quote, is the case for free trade so long a central tenet now invalidated? Despite what we have said about the effects of trade policy, we do not think so. So what this suggests somewhere, they have found that free trade theory doesn't work, but they're still like somehow not able to accept somewhere. I mean, the idea somewhere is that I think these marginalist neoclassical thinkers have a difficulty somewhere accepting that the state can never do anything good, right? I mean, in a way, right? And this is the role of ideology here, right? Theory is telling you it doesn't work, but no, somehow it works, because you have been trained like that as an economist when you went to Harvard or MIT or wherever you went to, and that you feel that that's what you learned, that's what your teachers thought. So you think that no, it still works. Maybe in the way we have modeled it doesn't, but objectively it works. So this is the role of ideology somewhere in economic theory that is important to recognize. Now, in terms of in the 80s, what we ended up seeing 90s is the application of neoclassical economics, new trade theories in the domain of neoliberal, in the domain of policy. And neoliberal policy became prominent. The works of Anne Kruger and many other scholars came up with this idea of new political economy, which is far removed, which was their attempt, a neoclassical attempt at political economy, but it was far removed from classical and Marxist idea and neo-Marxist ideas of political economy. So the name itself is a misnomer, it doesn't really work. But what they ended up arguing, the new political economy, is that you're basically going to have, arguing is that state is inefficient. Large public sector enterprises are not, giving subsidies. I can't see. What? 5 minutes? Okay, that's great. I think I can do it. 5 minutes. Thank you. So the new political economy recommendations were basically critical of the large size of state and the inefficiency of public sector enterprises in driving economic outcomes. And rather than actually looking at distributional conflict, rather than actually looking at uneven power relations between across geography. In terms of policy, what we saw is this long debate between ISI versus, in terms of industrial policy needed to promote trade and growth. We saw this long debate between ISI and import substituting industrialization versus export-oriented industrialization. It was argued that a lot of debate on why East Asia did better with EOI, why Latin America did poorer with ISI. Especially I'm referring to the debates of Ha-Joon Chang, Gabriel Palma, right? So what Palma argues is that in East Asia and Latin America, the difference was from a critical perspective. Of course, Palma is not a neoclassical thinker, but what he's saying is in Latin America, you saw that ISI strategy was abandoned whole scale, and there was a full shift to EOI, but in export-oriented industrialization. But in East Asia, they were pursued simultaneously. So as ISI was being phased out, export-oriented industrialization was being phased in, and that allowed for a smoother transition, right? So there's this long debate, and of course, the neoliberals were very critical of ISI policies, and this was institutionalized through international institutions, the WTO, General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, IMF with its structural adjustment programs, to all the developing countries who went to them when they were facing internal crises, debt crises. They went to IMF to borrow loans to fund its imports, and IMF gave loans to them on the condition of structural adjustment programs that you basically have to liberalize all parts of your economy. And the question, and some people say that what's wrong with that? Like, what is so wrong with liberalization? I don't think it's a question of liberalization being wrong. I think the problem is one-time liberalization of opening everything up, that rather than having liberalization in a more phased out manner, sectorally. If you look at like India itself, in the 85, during Rajiv Gandhi's era, we had the opening up of the automobile sector, right? Firms like Maruti collaborated with Suzuki to build the automobile industry. That is also liberalization, but it's happening in a more selective, phased out manner, rather than one-time liberalization of opening up every sector of your economy. What that resulted, the structural adjustment program's result has been very poor, right? And that's why Washington Consensus was changed into post-Washington Consensus, then there was post-Washington Consensus, and finally they gave up because the recommendations were still free trade, less state, more free trade, when data suggested otherwise. And we had a series of crises, right? Debt crisis in the 80s in Latin America to like East Asian financial crisis in 97, 98, opening up these East Asian economies to global competition, having a fully convertible capital account, which creates its own set of issues, to the vagaries of global financial capital, led to crises all across, but it was still recommended. So what has happened is not kept up. Free trade theory has not kept up pace with policy concerns of developing country governments, right? There's an internal contradiction of neoliberal trade theory, especially coming from these international institutions, the idea of kicking away the ladder that Chang famously said. On one hand, they're recommending more and more aggressive liberalization in the global south, but on the other hand, they're not doing that in the West, right? In their own countries, they are going for strategic policy. Why? To protect, because they have issues on unemployment, low growth. So they're going protectionist. And while, you can think of the high agricultural subsidies on wheat that US continues to have, that many developing country governments have a severe issue with, but, they still keep recommending that. So we have this policy complex, right? And what Chang is saying is that the developed countries became industrialized through active tariffs and subsidies. And now you're kicking away the ladder and saying the developing countries need to do it without any kind of state protection, which is the problem, right? Also, there's a whole set of narratives on the political economy of trade agreements itself, which I'm skipping. Now, I don't have time, so all I'm going to do is just run through it very quickly. So what we find is on the fringes of all this mainstream neoliberal debate on theory and policy-wise, mainstream neoliberal theory and policy, we have a development of a heterodox series of growth, right? Because the free trade doctrine doesn't link trade to growth and development patterns or to income distribution very clearly, theoretically. So we had a series of theories that came up to explain the impact of trade on growth and how it creates uneven development, how it creates unequal growth, right? Not going into the specifics. We had a series of neo-Marxist trade theories as well, all right? All of them establishing the idea of unequal exchange globally, uneven development, the idea of center periphery, how the periphery is left worse off, the idea of, somehow I missed that here, but the Latin American structuralists who talk about, deteriorating terms of trade, which is the idea that, I said that development literature picks up on the idea of terms of trade from classicals. The world system, famously world systems theory, dependency theory, which talks about, I can, just as an example, Andre Gunder Frank's very interesting work, Development of Underdevelopment, which is what it's saying is, as you have capitalist expansion globally, development and underdevelopment is simultaneously created in different regions of the world. As capital expands globally, some regions become developed while disempowering and disenfranchising other regions and creating underdevelopment. So the same process of capitalist expansion creates development and underdevelopment in different parts of the world, and so on. We had the deindustrialization and colonial past, that how the impact of colonization has been basically to rob developing countries of its resources, leading to deindustrialization. So once they became decolonized, they had to build industries all over again, right? Finally, we come to the idea of the most modern version of trade theory, where trade theory stands today, is the idea of global supply chains, global value chains, global production networks. And I would like to argue that despite the claims in the literature by Gary Gereffi, Stephanie Barrientos, who are kind of the pioneers of this field in certain sense, who argue that developing countries can benefit, actually GVC literature, which is kind of rich, has been appropriated by neoclassical theory to again push neoliberal fast policies in the global south. So a series of offshoring, outsourcing models came up. The GVC proponents basically said that they are critiquing the development paradigm, right? The development literature, and they're offering the entire development literature. Why? Because this development literature relies on meta-narratives. So what they're offering is a theory that is at the same...
Please wrap up.
Conclude, okay. So what they're offering is a theory that at the same time can speak of global production in a macro meta scale, but at the same time model firm level dynamics as well, right? And importantly, they shifted the focus from nation as a unit of analysis, nation state as a unit of analysis, to firm as a unit of analysis. And in doing so, they ignored the contributions of industrial organization literature. Basically, how do developing countries benefit in this literature? Two approaches: upgrading and governance structures. One is a bottom-up, the more micro thing, and governance structures is top-down. So countries can upgrade their productive structure, production capabilities by building their core competencies, and move up the value chain, right? And from producing low value-added goods to high value-added goods. Okay, another severe set of, series of concerns were raised against this as well. Basically, the idea that value chain is a very linear notion of understanding development. It's highly problematic. They focus on organizational learning, like how an organization upgrades and learns by doing trade and then upgrades its productive structure, its core competencies. But what they forgot is the idea of technology, or what they ignored is the idea of technological learning. Here I'm referring to the work of Pure and Sable on the second industrial divide, which is basically what they're saying is a choice of technology itself is in crisis. Okay, I'll wrap up. And a lot of other criticisms, new issues in terms of how global value chains are basically better described as global poverty chains, the work of Ben Selvin. We have to account for the idea of subordinate financialization, the link between financialization and trade, and the role of new digitalization in trade, right? And finally, to conclude, so are we at a crossroads or are we at a dead end in terms of where we stand and what to expect in terms of trade theory? We know that comparative advantage is no longer the way to think about trade patterns, and free trade policies have underperformed, right? Have really not lived up to expectation. Though policymakers continue to propose such approaches and push forth micro-theoretic formulations. So what's the future of trade theory? What are two issues we need to locate at the center of analysis is to locate income distribution. Still, even now, global value chains don't do that. And a lot of thinkers, even in the heterodox camp, said, isn't it better participating in global supply chains? One last minute, I'm done. Is it not better, even now, that participating in global supply chains means that a country, in a small nation like Belize or Guatemala, which couldn't participate in world trade, is participating, but you're participating in a hierarchical structure governed by large-scale transnational, multinational corporations. The ability of these firms in smaller economies to grow is highly suspect. It's not happening. So participation is not enough. Theoretically, what is important is to not just think in terms of quantity of jobs. That's what FDI does, creates more jobs, but they're all poor quality jobs. So quality of jobs matters. And especially in terms of trade policy, we are seeing a wave of populist nationalism all across the globe, from Turkey to India to UK. And what are the implications of that on trade remains an open question. I'm really sorry for taking the extra time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for your perfect presentation and clarification. If the audience have any questions, just raise just one or two questions only. Thank you. Okay.
It seems that there are many questions. Well, actually, I'm not having questions. I'm making comments because it's rather, in a way, funny. I'm sorry if I use this word. Probably it's not the correct one. Anyway, it's rather interesting, let's say, to see that in your review of the literature, which is critical, basically, on the neoliberal paradigm of international trade, you don't cite the most important critics to the. Yeah, I mean, for example, you don't even mention Cantillon. Okay, you mention it, but just and apart from that, there are some mistakes about the dates because when Hume speaks about the price-busy flow, it was not 1776, which is the year in which he dies, but it's 1752. And then in 1755, there is Cantillon response who says, no, come on, that's in the long run, but there is also a short run, which is very different, and the short run can be very long, actually. But apart from that, what is least? list, I mean, was crucial for the policy making. If you explore not just the theory, but also the policy making of the international trade, the list and his ideas of the stadiums, how do you call it, the phases of development is crucial also for the Latin American issue. I mean, Prebisch, the CEPAL, the whole structure, his ideas were based on that. Graham in 1923, he made very important and dramatic critiques to the comparative advantage theory. Fano in 1906, and then Mill. Okay, you quote Mill from the point of view of the price, the international trade price in equilibrium, but he also spoke about the infant industry argument. And then you don't have Peru. Peru was an important economist on the acknowledgement of power asymmetries in trade theories, although he didn't explore them very much in terms of models, and he didn't write in English, he only wrote in French, but I think you can read French. Sure. And Rosa Luxemburg also, I mean, Rosa Luxemburg was also, okay, in the Marxist line of thought, but again, she was very much important. I also have other issues, but I will tell you later at dinner. So sure. The next one, yeah.
He almost covered all my concerns. So my question was, how do you see power in this whole thing? You have mentioned power all the time. And the second, are you writing a book? You should.
Yeah, eventually. Hopefully. Not yet. Still fleshing it out very much. So thank you for all the... Sorry.
So I have the same comments as Fabio, and I also want to add to Friedrich List, to James Stewart, because you spend a lot of time on classical political economy, and also I think there is a parenthesis here that you didn't mention because you passed too fast from classical political economy to marginalism and then to Hescher-Ohlin, and between marginalism and Hescher-Ohlin, in particular in the United States, people like Frontosik, like Jacob Weiner, and then, to arrive to Ohlin. Yeah. Otherwise, we don't understand like how you jump from the 19th to 20th century. Right. And I really think that if if we are all here, is also to talk about our country. So for us in Latin America, all of these people are like, this is on the books. In the reality, Prebisch Singer is the dependency theory. So the other names, other people. So we cannot still giving so much spaces and so much, place. I know that you love Smith, and of course, absolute advantage, still important for me too, for sure. But there are many other authors.
Thank you.
Thank you. Even though I am not the academic case, but I am an educator, but I would like to know, okay, these mean your books or your paper research?
What?
Your books or your research paper?
No, I mean, I've been working, thinking about doing something on this and writing something, but there's no book here.
I just see what you read, only theory, but I didn't see the research that you underline. Okay, so that's why I asked you like that. Okay, so thank you for this.
Thank you. Thank you. No, I thank you so much for the comments. I fully take it. And, I mean, that's why I need to think more, spend more time on this, and there's so much to cover. It's 400 years of trade theory. I recognize Weiner. I just didn't put it in there. Luxembourg, I put it in there. But List is, thank you very much. I need to incorporate List. Absolutely. Developing country literature debates as well. I really need to incorporate. But I was more thinking of the standard way trade is thought, and kind of the issues in the kind of the idea that distributional conflict is something when I teach, I read these textbooks, I feel that it's barely there. So I kind of wanted to focus on the idea of distributional conflict from a political economy perspective. But thank you so much for all the recommendations. I look forward to getting more of your authors that I should include more recommendations. Thank you. All the points are very well taken.
One more question.
Just quickly respond. I think power in a more hierarchical way, right? If you look at trade regimes, there's still I would still think in terms of neo-imperialism and power working in new imperialist kind of terms, right? So it's yeah, so thinking of power in a hierarchical sense, the idea of hegemons, like now you are seeing multiple centers of power. If you think of Samir Amin and the idea that it's beyond US hegemony, now what the future is about, like multiple centers of power, that we are going to see. The future will be like multipolar, not bipolar, but multipolar centers of power, all fighting with each other for the world economy. So I think that in some sense, in that terms.
Yes, I have one question.
Yeah,
So, thank you very much for a good review of international trade theory from the mercantilist to David Ricardo. So, what is missing here is I want to know the effect of green growth policies. So green growth policies is adopted by global North and also global South. Like Cambodia also has a green growth policies. So in your opinion, so what is the effect of green growth policy on comparative advantage and also on the volume of international trade? So it will slower volume of trade in the futures, or it will increase it, and as well as the effect on economic growth in the future? Is all countries, both rich and poor, adopt these green growth policies? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's a lot. There's a lot to unpack in that comment. I'll try to do my best to answer that. Green growth policies. See, I'm not very familiar with it, so I'll be honest that I don't have a very clear answer on that. It's just that maybe if I have to think about it, I mean, I think again there is a political economy dynamic here. The developed countries used all the coal in the planet they could to build their economies, and now you're asking for developing countries to do it without any kind of resort to coal. I mean, of course, there's a problem there, but that we are destroying the environment by using coal. But still, at some point, I think there's again a certain kind of political economy as dimension going there. I think this idea of degrowth in terms of growth, in terms of green policies which have come up, is I think more applicable in the West. For them, degrowth is kind of maybe more relevant. But I think in developing countries, we want to think of maybe other ways. I'm trying to recall this person I read, but I'm not able to recall right now. I'll look up the internet and get back to you with the person I thought about when giving this answer. And especially coming to volume, is it going to increase or decrease in the future? I think since 90s, we have seen trade volume grow significantly, and especially through FDIs. The FDI kind of boom that we have seen in the developing world has increased like trade volume significantly. But some like Dahi and Damir, there are these scholars who argue that it's a question also about like volume versus composition. So I think trade volume versus trade composition. So you can have more trade volume, but more important than that, according to those thinkers, is that maybe you want to focus more on what do you export, the composition of trade. What you trade matters, like Roderick says. So what you export, the composition of your export basket, moving from low to high value-added production, right? Challenging the hierarchy of developed world in terms of having a monopoly in technology. I think that's where maybe the debate is. So trade volume matters, but I think at some level, developing countries should think about strengthening the export composition somewhere. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor, for your excellent presentation. So right now, I have to say, what? Okay. For the audience online, do you have any question related to this presentation? Okay, maybe we don't have a more question. So I can say like we can close the session by today. So I give the floor to the MC. She might inform the others session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair, for facilitating this second plenary session for today. So that is it for our conference for today. So our last agenda would be a welcome dinner, as you see in the agenda. So as for transportation to the place, I think you may have to find your own method of going there by yourself, but we'll drop the Google map to the restaurant that we'll have dinner together. And if you have any question or need any facilitation from or support from our team, please let us know. Thank you.
Hello, Daniel, and thank you so much for your time this evening. And yes, have a good day. Bye-bye. Hope to see you in person soon.
Yes, likewise. See you, everyone. Enjoy the dinner.
Yeah. Yeah.